everybody that there's no audio or video recording and no photographs. All right, so if we get down into it, we're going to talk about working with federal censuses today. And we are very, very lucky today to have access to all kinds of census indexes and several websites offering access to census images all online. That was not something that was available to us back in the way back dark ages when it was all about turning microfilm reels and hoping you got lucky and find out what you're looking for rather than getting that weird kind of motion sickness thing that you used to get from scrolling for hours. Maybe some of you know what I'm talking about there. But even today, with all of this available online, at home even, we still may run into trouble finding people in the census, whether they just aren't where we think that they should be, or they've been indexed with a crazy spelling of a name. Whatever the reason, it can be hard not to think, did my family get skipped by the enumerator? We've probably all heard some instances where someone may not get counted, or even whole streets or neighborhoods getting missed. But while there are some legitimate examples of people being skipped in the censuses, these incidences are limited. More than likely, your people are probably hiding somewhere rather than being skipped. They're actually far more likely to have been enumerated twice than they were to get skipped. So if that's true, how can you find them? So this is what we're going to be talking a little about today. Some of the things that you can try, some tools that are available to help you determine whether your research subjects may just be hidden and require a little more digging, or if they actually may have gotten skipped. And we're going to do this with a little help from some of my own family members. So this is the Charles Stevens family of Chicago. This family should have been enumerated in Chicago in 1900. Everything that I thought I knew said that they should be there. They should have been there, but they weren't found for many, many years. So how do we go about finding people in the census who don't show up where or how we expect? So we're going to use the Stevens family as a guide, and we'll see how to build and use timelines, how to fill in census info with city directories. We're going to talk a little about how to get creative with our census searches, and we're going to cast a wide net when we're doing that searching. And then we'll also take a look at some of the tools that we have at our disposal. Which brings us to tip 1. A little bit ago, I just said that the Stevens family should have been in Chicago in 1900 and should have been enumerated there. But how do I know that they should have been there? When you think you might be faced with this question, the first thing I like to do is start fresh and lay a foundation with what I know. And I said what I know, not what I think I know, what I've heard should have happened. We're talking about what have you verified? What do you have documentation for? So that's where we're going to begin. And like I said, we're going to start with Charles T. Stevens. You can see him on the left here with his sister Emma and his brother Albert on the right. Charles was born on November 13th, 1858 in Melrose, Massachusetts. And we have his birth record here. Hopefully you can see it a little better there. We can see that November 13th date of birth, Charles Thomas Stevens, son of Charles and Caroline. So now we have our first documented event. To get that foundation of verified information that we really need, timelines work wonderfully. They allow you to see what you have and see where any gaps or any conflicts may occur. So we enter this birth date and place in our timeline and we move forward. The next event we have is the family's appearance in the 1860 federal census, where Charles is enumerated with his parents, 2 siblings, and also a half-uncle. And we actually can find Charles in his parents' household through to 1880. So let's see, here he is in the 1865 Massachusetts state census, where he's enumerated in his grandfather's home in Boston. Also, his parents and siblings are there. This is 1870, again, mother, father, siblings. And here's that 1880 census where Charles is with his mother. His father has died by this point, and then his sister. So we can now add all of these census appearances in our timeline. And we have events now beginning in 1858 with Charles's birth, and then going up to 1880. At this point, the family's still living in Massachusetts. Things are looking pretty consistent, and we're not seeing any real craziness that might cause problems for us later. But at this point, make sure this is what you're doing, because I'm pretty sure you guys should be doing something or already doing something like this. And if you're not, give it a try. It'll really help you. But from this point on, things are going to get a little trickier. Our Charles's father, who was also named Charles, just for fun, I guess, died in 1875. And in 1884, his mother, Caroline, remarried to Matthew Van Wormer in Melrose, Massachusetts. This is their marriage record. A year later, in 1885, Charles married Lillian Bromigam, also in Melrose, Massachusetts. This is that marriage record. And their son, you'll be shocked to hear, I'm sure, was also named Charles. He was born in Canada while the family was living there in 1887. And then in 1907, young Charles marries Helena, or she was known as Lena Sigmund, in Lake County, Indiana. And Charles and Lena raised their family in the Chicago area, and they can be seen in censuses there from about 1910 onwards until they both died in the suburbs in the 60s. So we know a lot about this family group. We can document their movements pretty consistently from that 1858 birth of Charles T. down to the death of his son in the 60s. For our purposes here, I only went up to 1910 in this table, but this does carry forward. So we've got over 100 years of the family's births, marriages, deaths, and residence, all documented in vital records, newspapers, military records, and those federal censuses. We've got all kinds of source material that's going into building this timeline of events for this family's story for that roughly 100-year period. But if we take a closer look at our compiled timeline, we see that we have a gap here in that period between 1885 and 1907. The 1887 birth of Charles L. is only documented in his Social Security application much, much later on. So really what we have is the marriage of his parents in 1885, but then nothing else until Charles L.'s marriage to Lena in 1907. And not only do we have a gap in records documenting the family during this period, but we have a pretty big omission in the list of federal censuses for this period. And that's not only because of the loss of the 1890 census. We're also missing them in the 1900 census. And during this period, the family looks like they were doing some moving from Massachusetts west to Indiana and Illinois. So we really need to figure out what's going on during this gap. So some of the family's movements during this period were published in NGS Magazine in 2015 in an article called What Happened to Eliza. So you can find more detail there, but the basic gist is that the Stevens family intermarried with the Van Wormer family, as we saw in some of those marriage records during the 1880s. And the patriarch of that group was Matthew Van Wormer. Now, Matthew was an interesting guy. He was an inventor, and this is a drawing from one of his patent files for something called a dumping car. Matthew had a son from his first wife. His name was Clemson Lee. And apparently Clemson was a shyster, is the word that I like to use. It appears that he set up a con to scam people out of their money by investing in his father's patent ideas. Well, he went a bit too far by exploiting several $1,000s off of people in Massachusetts, and that's several $1,000s in the 1880s. So Clement was in trouble, and he went on a run, and his family followed him all the way to Canada. And that's where we find them in the 1891 census of Canada. Here he is living with his wife and two children, Park and Viola. They were in Toronto at this time. Well, both Matthew and Clemson died in Canada in 1890 and 1891, respectively. And once that happened, there really wasn't much reason for the rest of the family to stay in Canada. So they came back, and that was mainly the widows and their children and maybe grandchildren came back home to the United States. But they didn't go back to Massachusetts. They settled in the Chicago area. We know that they settled in Chicago because amongst the surviving group were two Civil War soldiers' widows. We have Charles T. Stevens' mother, Caroline, and then his mother-in-law, Mary J. Bromigam. The widow's pension applications for these two women included affidavits where they were testifying for each other. And those affidavits are dated through the 1890s. And you can see in this one from Cook County. So this one is from Charles's mother, Caroline. It's dated 1893. And it says she's a resident of Chicago. So now this is what our timeline looks like. We've got all of those census and vital records, and we've closed that gap a little bit leading up to just before 1900. So our next step should logically be that 1900 census. Based on their location between 1893 and 1910, we should find them in Chicago, right? Now, Lake County, the location of Charles L.'s marriage in 1907, is a known Gretna grain for Chicago. So that also supports the theory that the family should be found in Chicago in the 1900 census. But this is what I got when I searched for Charles. He's not there. There are a lot of Charles Stevens in Chicago, even a couple who are said to have been born in Massachusetts, but none of these are the right man. And you can see I entered a similar and sounds like name search, and then I narrowed down the location to find an exact match only. I did leave out the date and place of birth to kind of keep things loose, but it didn't help. So what can I do now? What can I do if research shows that someone should be found somewhere, but they're not? So now we're at the next tip, and that's to play with the search function. The first thing that can often make a difference in your search results is simply trying different names. Try nicknames, try different spelling variations. Think about how a name sounds when you say it out loud, and just loosen up the search terms a bit. Remember that the enumerator was writing down answers as he heard them. So phonetics really do matter here. And I've got a really good example of that. This issue came up in another research project. I was looking for a man named Joseph Cottingham and his wife, Henrietta, in the 1900 census in Baltimore. And maybe just take a second and think about how Cottingham could have shown up. I think you'll be surprised. Yeah, I eventually found them enumerated as the Pottingham family. And just as an FYI, they turned up in other records, not this census, but other vital records and newspapers and things under the name Cunningham. So things were kind of all over the board with this group because, again, phonetics matter here. When someone asks what your name is and you reply, they will write what they hear or what they think they hear. So if you say the name Cottingham, you can kind of start to understand maybe why the enumerator wrote Pottingham, 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 Pottingham. Whereas if you just look at the written letters, you might be confused about that jump because a C doesn't look anything like a P, right? It's only when you say it out loud that it becomes a little more clearer. Another thing that this search taught me is to not limit your search to just one person. The way that I found this family group was not by looking for Joseph, but by looking for their daughter, Tina. Her name was by far the more unusual for the time and the place, so it was much easier to search for girls named Tina in Baltimore than it was to sort through all of the various Josephs, for example. Even Henrietta it wasn't a short list. And further than that, Tina's age also varied widely across all of the records that I had collected for her. So removing her year of birth from the search box also was very helpful in locating this family group. So another thing to keep in mind is wildcards. Wildcards can be very helpful, but you must understand how to use them. Ancestry uses the asterisk and the question mark as wildcards for up to 5 characters. Family Search also use the asterisks for wildcard searches, but they give us a little more help. So if you take a look at the Family Search Wiki, you'll find a couple of wiki pages with search tips available for use on the Family Search page, but also other sites as well. So it's really worth taking a look at this. Not every site offers this kind of information. You saw in the previous slide, Ancestry's page about using wildcard searches wasn't like this. So not every site will do this, so it's definitely worth taking some time and familiarizing yourself with these functions and tips for whichever site you are searching. So we've kind of been collecting some good rules of thumb here, besides playing with the name variations. Remember that ages and locations can show up differently from census year to year, depending on things like the unidentified informant and even memory. Then you've got those occasions where, say, a married couple might have a large age gap, and one spouse might want to close that gap a little by fibbing about their age. So be loose with those search years and places. Don't get too tied down by things that you think you know, because those things may not show up the way you think they will. And we can use these tips to try and find our friends, the Charles Stevens family, by searching for his wife, Lillian, right? Maybe that'll help. Maybe there were fewer Lillians than Charleses in 1900. And we can keep our location loose by looking at the county level rather than entering the city. I won't enter any age or place of birth because, as we've learned, right, those can also turn up wonky. Well, unfortunately, the search results for Lillian rather than Charles, they aren't much better. There are definitely fewer possibilities, but none of these are Charles T's wife. We are simply not finding the right family by looking for Charles or Lillian. And their son's name was Charles too, right? So that's not going to be much help to us. So we're going to need to try something else. So the next tip is to use city directories. City directories can be super helpful for finding your subjects in the census. First, and the most obvious, is that they can confirm whether you're even looking in the right area. If you find your subject in the city directory, then you at least know that you're probably searching in the right place, right? And this goes back to that first tip, to just check your documentation, check to make sure facts line up, check your timelines. All of these things can be crucial steps in achieving success with locating people in the censuses. For Chicago, we are lucky to have directories for quite a few years on sites like Ancestry, Family Search, Fold3, also HathiTrust, Google Books, and more than that. But I would also strongly recommend checking the libraries in the area you're searching, because they'll often have collections either in print or on microfilm or in some other format. Sometimes I've seen them on microfiche. But many of these libraries are willing to send you copies of the images you're looking for a nominal fee. So even if you're doing research from out of state, you may still be able to get what you need. Several years ago, I was working on another project and I was able to get copies of several city directories from a small local library in Massachusetts. And what was really cool about that is the person that was filling that request actually threw in a few other things like newspaper clippings and other items that they thought may be of interest to me because they were talking about the same family group. And nothing that library sent me was online at the time that I made that request. And still to this day, some of the things I got from that library's collection are not online. And I wouldn't even have any idea that they existed, some of those things. So it's really worth your time to remember those local and offline resources. Also, don't be too quick to think that because your subject lived in a rural county, that there won't be any kind of directory. This isn't always the case. And even if it is, we have other options available, things like farm directories, church directories. There are all kinds of directories for people living in these locales to get in touch with those around them. So look for those in the local repositories or even in state historical societies. Often these materials can be found in places like maybe you've missed the first time, smaller locations. That's not to say that the larger ones don't. The Wisconsin Historical Society is one that I think of as a really good example of a state society with a large local collection that include many of these locale specific items. And they've even put some of those things online as well. So it's a really great website if you're looking for folks there. It's a really good model. I think I hope other states follow their example there. But no worries if your state doesn't have that going yet. Still check the local historical societies and see what they've got. You might be really surprised and pleased with what you can find there. So let's look at a city directory entry for our friend Charles T. And from our compiled information, he appears usually as an electrician or sometimes as a mechanic. And we find a Charles T. Stevens in Chicago city directories with that occupation, living at 5422 Bishop Street. So this is an entry for, let's see what year. It looks like 1894. But at the time, I did go through several years through the 1890s and then also 1901 to make sure that we had a range of dates with consistent information. You may find that your subject's address changes during the time period that you're looking at. So you could be looking at multiple possible addresses, which might affect how or if you find the person. So keep that in mind. For us, we know he was at 5422 Bishop in 1900, thanks to the city directories, and he should be in the census at that address. But we run into a problem now because we can't just hop on Ancestry and do a search for 5422 Bishop and hope that he turns up. For the 1900 census, the U.S. was divided up into 297 supervisors' districts and then into more than 52,000 enumeration districts. This works out to be nearly 2,000 rolls of microfilm for the federal copies. Chicago alone is covered by over 50 rolls of microfilm. That's a lot. So when we're looking at the census and we're trying to find an address, it kind of feels like we're almost looking for a needle in a haystack. The situation is a little less dire when you're looking for an address in a more rural area, but doing a page-by-page search through several townships or multiple enumeration districts can still be kind of grueling. Well, we get a good tool. Thank goodness. Steve Morse's website is probably the best known site for census tools, and you'll see why here in a second. But I wanted to show you this homepage because he doesn't just include census tools. There are also tools to help with Ellis Island searches and searches outside the US as well. So if this is a new website to you, take some time, look around, experiment. So for us today, we're looking at the census tool, and we'll go to the Unified Census ED Finder page. And in this case, we're looking for an ED, enumeration district, in the 1900 census. So we would use the 1880 to 1950 finder. So at the top of the page, we'll choose the year that we need from the drop-down menu. So we'll choose that 1900. And then we'll do the same for the state, the county, and then the city or town. Are you ready to see what we get? Ta-da! From this point, below the drop-down menus we just set, we get a list of all of the enumeration districts which are possible for the specified location. This is just the first batch. There's more. Yeah, another full page. Each of these highlighted numbers is an enumeration district. Can you imagine having to go page by page through each one of these? I mean, just looking at these slides makes my eyes water, so I'm going to switch off there. Okay. The good news is we don't have to do all of that because the tool allows you to enter an address to narrow down the choices. So we'll go back to the top of the page, and here's where doing our city directory searches really comes in handy because we can just enter that 5422 Bishop address here. And what we get back is a much more manageable result, right? We can handle this, but there may be even more that we can do. Some enumeration district maps are available online, either through family search, as you can see here, or through the National Archives website as well. Now, if the time and place that you're looking for does have those available ED maps, you should see something like this. This is an ED map from 1940 for Stager, Illinois. Now, the boundary between Cook County and Will County runs right through the town, right down 34th Street. So this map is a really great way to see where that division was, as well as which EDs were in Cook County and which were in Will County. So you need to know where you need to be looking. Because this town falls within 2 counties, there are 2 EDs covered on this map. The part of Stager that falls in Cook County is towards the top at the part of the map. You can see there's a little notation in the margin there that says Cook County, and then Will County is at the bottom. Cook County is given the ED 1665, and then the bottom part for Will County has ED 99-4, and you can see those at the top. So we can use the ED maps to find the street and hopefully the block in order to figure out which ED or EDs might cover the address you're looking for. In this case, if the address is south of 34th Street, we know it's in Will County, and if it's north of 34th Street, it'll be in Cook County and then have the respective ED numbers. So we can take that information back to Ancestry, and on the 1940 census page, you'll see a box on the right side to browse the collection. Use your drop downs to enter the state and county and the town as well. And then you'll see the list of enumeration districts pop up, and that's where we'll find that 99-4 that we got from the map for Will County. So that's pretty helpful, right? And then from there, we can go through and do our page-by-page search, which is certainly better than having to do page-by-page searches through multiple EDs, which, as we saw earlier in the case of that first list of Chicago EDs, things can get a little crazy. So it's much nicer to have this more manageable option open to us. But I did say earlier, there may not be an available ED map for you. And in those situations, you may be able to find the enumeration district descriptions on the National Archives website, or even on a local GenWeb website, if y'all are familiar with those. Some of them have been uploaded. And these will just tell you the boundaries of those EDs. So you still might be able to narrow things down that way as long as you have an area that you're looking at. I did not have a census enumeration description at the time, so if the people you're looking for aren't turning up in searches, page-by-page searches might be the only way to go. So using those city directories to point you to the right enumeration district so you can search page by page, Well, that's all fine and good if you can find your subject in the city directory in the first place. But what happens when you can't find your subject in the census and you can't find them in the city directory either? Well, let's go back to that earlier tip where we said not to be too rigid with your searching. Searching 20 different ways for one person doesn't cover all of what we're talking about. A family is made up of more than one person, right? So we need to look at the family, all of the family, and remember that Cottingham-Pottingham example. That family was found by looking for the daughter of that family group. So can we do the same with Charles? We need to look at spouses, children, any extended family members that were known to live with them or could have been living with or near them. And we need to expand our search to include all of these folks. So I did searches looking not only for Charles T. Stevens, but also his wife Lillian and their son Charles L. As you saw, those searches didn't turn up anything. But we discovered earlier on in our discussion that the move to Chicago was a multi-family move, and it included several in-laws. So might we want to include them in our list as well? Of course. And so this is what we get. That adds Charles T.'s mother, Caroline. She was known as Carrie. She had married Matthew Van Wormer, but Matthew was now dead, so we would be looking for the widow. The pension paperwork makes it seem like she was certainly in Chicago with the rest of the family, at least for a time. So we've definitely got her added to the list. We're also going to include Lillian's mother, Mary. Her pension paperwork also showed that she was living in Chicago during this period, along with her son, George. So now our list of people to look for has gotten a little bit longer, and we're giving ourselves a better chance of locating the group. But sometimes we can cast our net even wider than that. If your research subject hadn't been running from the law during the 1890s, like the Stevens group here, and instead they were pretty steady in their location so that you can see the names of their neighbors, especially those neighbors who might appear near them on multiple census schedules, you can try and find them in the census and hope your subjects will still be near them. Now, if you don't know who the neighbors are, there's something else that you might try. Sites like Fold3 allow you to search for an address within the city directory to see who was living at nearby addresses to your subject. If you find someone there, you can try searching in the census for those people, and you may find your subjects that way. So for this search, I put several addresses near my family's address at 5422 Bishop in quotes within the database for the 1900 census. 1900 Chicago City Directory. And I got a hit with 5436 Bishop. Now, I do want to extend a word of caution on this because the last time I checked, the OCR is not perfect. So you're likely not going to pick up everything. But if you get lucky, it can expand your search net by helping you find potential neighbors in the census. So that 5436 address in the 1900 city directory, that belonged to a laborer named Michael Wessenlin. But I didn't find Michael in the 1900 census either. Didn't work for me this time, but this is something that you can try with your own research, and maybe you'll be luckier than I was. I have heard success stories. All is not lost for me though, right? Because I do have a pretty good list of people to search for. We know we haven't been able to find Charles T. or Lillian, but maybe we can find some of these others. Uh, so I'm not going to drag you along anymore. I'm going to cut to the chase here and just tell you the answer to that is no. I did not find most of those people using the search box with any terms or wildcards or neighbors. I searched without given names. I searched first names without surnames. I used places of birth and then removed them. I removed places and dates as search criteria. I did all of the tricks that we've talked about and nothing turned up. The only person that I found was Charles T's sister-in-law, his wife's sister Eliza. That's that Lita from the NGS magazine article. She was living with her own family, though, in 1900. She was living apart. There wasn't anybody else living near her. Nobody else was found nearby. So the time had come for me to accept my fate and search page by page. Thanks to that Steve Morse tool, though, my work was much less of a problem than it would have been otherwise. Remember the eye-watering lists, right? But it was still a page-by-page search through multiple EDs. And I had success with this. Thanks to the Steve Morse tool, I had those handful of EDs to look through. And this is one from that list. This is ED 918. And then I just looked for the address that we found in the city directory. So let me show you a little closer, show you how the Charles T. Stevens family was enumerated in the 1900 census. So that's Stevens with a PH rather than a V, which they never used. And then just Roy. There are no ages, no places of birth, no occupations, nothing except the surname, the address, which is cramped in this image, but it's all the way on the left side in the margin. It says 5422 and then Bishop, and then Roy. So thanks to the address and the surname, we can say we're looking at the right household. But what is happening here and who is Roy? Well, if you look over in that left inside margin, the enumerator has put the street names there. And we can see there are entries on something like 8 different streets here on this one page, which happens to be at the very end of the ED. And then in that inside margin are insertions referring to other lines. So what this is a page listing people who the enumerator had previously visited on his route, but he hadn't gotten any information from them on that first visit, whether usually they didn't answer on the first visit. And we know that this is the situation because we have the instructions to census enumerators. If we go back to that handy dandy Census Bureau website, the instructions to enumerators are available for all years, including 1900. This brings us to another tip. Know what the census instructions say. Often, if you see something that looks weird or you're not finding something where you think you should be finding it, the instructions to census enumerators might offer an explanation. Here, the instructions detail the procedure enumerators were to follow while canvassing their assigned areas. Basically, they were supposed to go block by block, entering information for each household where there was someone present to provide the information that was required. Now, in those cases where no one appeared to be home when the enumerator arrived, the enumerator was to continue his work block by block and try to visit the home again on a second or even a third visit. Whenever they were able to get the information for a family, He would enter them on that page, designating their location as described in the instructions here. So this explains why all of those entries on that page with the Stevens are from all over the area, and why some refer to other lines on other pages, which may include the names of others in that household. It also shows why the Stevens entry was on the second to the last page for the ED rather than on other pages showing that part of the ED. These were likely the entries from his last attempts at visiting those households that he had previously been unable to find someone at home. As for the identity of Roy, who appears as a son to the nameless head of household, we know that Charles T. and Lillian's son, their only son, was named Charles L., who was born about 1887, 1888, somewhere in there. Well, earlier we saw his 1907 marriage record to Lena Sigmund, and it tells us that L stood for Leroy, which helps to identify that Roy in the census as the 12-year-old son of Charles and Lillian. When I was searching for that list of family members we created, I was searching for him as Charles or Charles L., and I even searched for Leroy. But I did not think to shorten that to Roy, and I didn't have any family information that showed he ever even went by that name. And that meant I had to take a much more roundabout approach to finding them. And by roundabout, I do mean roundabout, because just as I was doing the slides for this presentation, I thought, let me see how much easier my search would have been if I had thought to search for Roy, and I'm so embarrassed. How many Roy Stevens or similar variations were enumerated in Cook County in 1900? 5, just 5. I would have found them immediately. I will say that without the address that we got from searching the city directories, though, I wouldn't have had a very strong case to confirm that that was them, that was the correct entry. We did kind of need that address confirmation to verify, since everybody else was shown without a name, without an age, without a place of birth. All of that stuff was missing. All of that context was missing. All of those points of correlation were missing. But still, 5 people. It's so embarrassing. But this is the thing. You don't know how people are going to appear in these records. Everything that's been recorded was written by the enumerator from information that he was told by someone else who may or may not have even been in the family or known what they were talking about. So it's easy to look back now and say, man, that was a dumb move, not thinking of searching for Roy. But it does make a good point to understand just how necessary these flexible searches are when we're trying to find people in the federal census. In this case, my guess is that the enumerator stopped by the house again to make his final visit. Nobody was home or nobody answered the door, but maybe there were some kids outside playing in the street. He asked them, hey, do you know who lives there? And they said, oh yeah, that's Roy's house. That's my guess on what happened there. Coincidentally, on the same page where we find Roy, we also find the household of Mary Bermisham and her unnamed son on Laughlin Street. Remember, if you recall this list that we made, our extended list, one of the family members that I was looking for was Lillian's mother, Mary Bromigam. Lillian had 3 siblings, including her sister Lita, who I mentioned was married and off in her own household in 1900. But Lillian also had 2 brothers. One had died in 1895, which left one remaining brother named George. And then Lillian's mother, Mary, who could have been living on their own. They could have been living separately or together at that point. But neither George nor Mary were found in my initial name searches. But I have to tell you, after years of researching that family, the Bromagam surname is always a garbled mess, which makes this Mary Bermasham a possibility for me. Her address again was shown in the census sheet, so I did a quick search for her and George in the city directory to help with the identification. And the address that was provided in the census was 5416 Laughlin. And while Mary was not found in the city directory of 1900, George was. And you can see his address is listed as 5416 Laughlin. So we're back to the question from the beginning. Did my family get skipped? And I'm going to be honest with you. For me, it kind of feels like a gray area. Technically, no, they're there. We found them. The household is there, right where all of my documentations and my timelines said that they should be at the time they should have been there. In order to find them, though, we had to start fresh, and we had to make sure that we had the documents to back up our assumptions about where the family was supposed to be at a certain time. And timelines really helped us to see the chronology of events and the movements to help us establish that suspected location where we should be looking. We tried using various search terms, and we even looked at multiple search subjects to help widen that net. We looked at city directories to help confirm what our research suggested and to provide us with information that we could then use in conjunction with other tools like that census finder on the Steve Morse website. And we looked at the census instructions to understand what we were looking at once the correct household was found. And we were even able to find not just the person who seemed to be missing from that 1900 census, but 2 other related households as well that had previously been missing. But all of this may not always solve the problem for you. And in these cases, there may actually be circumstances preventing you from finding someone in the census or suggesting that a household or even a neighborhood may have been skipped. So in the handout for this session, there are some extra links for further tips. One of these is a really great article on census searching strategies that you can find on the Family Search website. And there's great tips like keeping a research log to record all of your search terms and where you're looking so that you eliminate any duplicate searching. Another great tip from this article is to try looking at the census on another website. For instance, if you're having trouble searching on Ancestry or you come up with a page, sometimes the film is black or it's really dark or opposite, really, really light. Either way, you can't read it. It's illegible. In those cases, you can go to a site like Family Search or even Internet Archive if you know the right ED or EDs that you want to check. So remember that you're not limited to just one site or one source. Another tip is to look for published articles that include some census searching to help with some inspiration on how to find those who are proving difficult to find. One of these is a 1993 article published in the NGSQ by Ruth Hatton. If you are a member of NGS, the National Genealogical Society, you can access their full archive of articles, including this one, on their website. And as I mentioned at the very beginning of this talk, there are some documented issues in certain censuses which may affect your census searching. Searching blogs and other articles for specific census issues can help you find out whether there were any issues for the year you're searching. For example, the blog for the New England Historic Genealogical Society, Vita Brevis, posted about an issue of a possible missing neighborhood in 2019. The blog posting details the search for several people who lived on a particular road in Brookline, Massachusetts in 1940, and they all appeared to be missing from the census. And as it turns out, several households on that road had actually been skipped. And also, we talked a little bit about the ED maps and the ED descriptions that are available on the National Archives website, but they have quite a bit more available regarding the federal censuses on that page. Now, there are several census-specific pages on the NARAL website with information, resources, and tools for all federal census years. It really is a ton of information that's packed into these pages, so it's really worth taking some time and familiarizing yourself with what's available here. One other thing to remember is that the population schedules aren't the only federal censuses that are available to us. We don't have time to go into detail on all of these today, but there were things like agricultural schedules, mortality schedules, special schedules enumerating deaf individuals, seamen, and more. You can find some of these on sites like Ancestry, Family Search, Fold 3, the usual suspects. But remember that NARA's census information pages include listings of census schedules by decade. So if you click on, say, 1890, you'll get a list of available schedules for that decade. And look, 1890 is not empty. It includes a link to what remains of that 1890 census, as well as a logbook for the agent in Alaska. It includes 18 families. We also have the 1890 schedule of Union veterans and widows in the Civil War, and the territorial census for Oklahoma in 1890. There are also several links for more information on the schedules. So really, do not forget the NARA site when you're searching for census information. And if all else fails, remember that the censuses are one record taken every 10 years. There are tons of other records out there where you may be able to find your subjects. Things like newspapers, land records, tax records, probate records, military records, and the list goes on and on. So do not get discouraged. You have to get out there, you have to dig deep, and you'll find your people. And that's it for me. Thank you.